Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for Rensselaer's Global Changers panel online discussion presented by the Rensselaer New England Executive Council. The impact of COVID-19 on healthcare industry, emerging insights for a transformative change. This afternoon, we have nearly 200 of you registered for this exciting panel discussion as part of the newly established Rensselaer Global Game Panel online series. These webinars are high-profile thought leadership panel discussions presented by regional executive councils in key geographic regions, including New England, New York City, and Silicon Valley. Each panel features topics of emerging global importance with alumni and alumnae leaders in business, innovation, intellectual discovery, and entrepreneurship. A session focusing on current and future consumer expectations will be following on June 24th. More details will be shared at the end of today's session. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please make sure that your volume is turned all the way up, or you will be muted throughout the presentation out of respect to our presenters. You will see that there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type in your questions and we will get to them as time allows during the Q&A portion of the program. I'm now pleased to introduce Catherine Murtaugh, Esquire, 1987, is co-chair of the Rensselaer New England Executive Council, trustee at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Chief Compliance Officer and Managing Director for Sustainable Investing at Harvard Management Company Incorporated, a subsidiary of Harvard University.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to everyone in attendance for joining us today. I'm pleased to announce that Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, President of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, is on this webinar today as an attendee, along with fellow trustees of the Institute, Curtis Preem, class of 1982, and Secretary of the Board, Jeffrey Kodowski, class of 1970. During this period of uncertainty, COVID-19 is affecting industries across the globe, and education is no exception. Many of you have asked how you might help students in this uncertain time. The need for support, in fact, is greater than ever. Together, we can make a difference and help our current generation of students complete their Rensselaer education. I encourage you to join me in supporting the annual fund so that students of today are able to become the future leaders of science, technology, and innovation. More details will be shared at the end of today's session, and I thank you in advance for your support. As mentioned, the Rensselaer Global Game Changers Panel online webinars are a virtual version of these panel discussions and are presented by executive councils in key regions where there are engaged alumni, alumnae, and parents who are innovators, senior executives, and venture capitalists. These regional networks and executive councils have been created to strengthen these connections and offer opportunities for engagement. Today's conversation is presented by the Rensselaer New England Executive Council, where nearly 35,000 alumni, alumnae, and parents call home. I would like to introduce the moderator of today's discussion, Dr. Robert Hull, Acting Vice President for Research, the Henry Burlage Jr. Professor of Engineering, and the Director of the Center for Materials, Devices, and Integrated Systems at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Prior to joining Rensselaer, Dr. Hull spent about a decade at Bell Laboratories in the Physics Research Division and 12 years at the University of Virginia, where he was the director of the NSF Materials Research Science and Engineering Center and director of the UVA Institute for Nanoscale and Quantum Science. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hull.
Thank you very much, Ms. Murtaugh, for that introduction. As Acting Vice President for Research at Rensselaer, I am very grateful for the support we have received from many of you. This allows us to continue our world-leading research on many fronts, and in particular, on the forefront of research in battling the COVID-19 pandemic. So our researchers continue to seek new therapeutic solutions to the treatment of the disease. They are developing new methods for predicting, tracking, and analyzing epidemiological spread. They are developing new materials and manufacturing methods for addressing the challenges of the supply of personal protective equipment. And we have also allocated AMOS, one of the world's most powerful computing systems, and a result of our long-standing partnership with IBM, to research focused on addressing the global pandemic. And this is a linchpin of the National COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium. So I'm very pleased to be moderating this exceptional conversation with our panelists. I would like first to introduce Ms. Tracy Accardi of the class of 1985, who is the Global Vice President of Surgical Robotics in the Minimally Invasive Therapy Group at Medtronic. In this role, Ms. Accardi leads a global team of engineers and scientists in the development of soft tissue robotics and advanced navigation and visualization systems. Our second panelist is Dr. Gary Gottlieb of the class of 1979, and he is Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, an executive partner at Flair Capital Partners, former CEO for Partners Healthcare System, and a former CEO for Partners in Health, a global non-governmental organization providing a preferential option for the poor in healthcare in severely resource-constrained settings. Finally, Dr. Patrice Milos of the class of 1982 and 1984 is co-founder, president, and CEO of Medley Genomics, where her efforts focus on developing the company's business strategy and building partnerships with pharmaceutical companies and academic medical centers with an initial focus in oncology. So I want to welcome and thank Ms. Accardi, Dr. Gottlieb, and Dr. Milos, and thank you for joining us in this panel. So now we're going to move to some questions for the panelists, and we'll be later taking questions from the audience. But I've got a handful of questions I want our panelists to answer and to discuss. So the first group of questions the first group of two is dealing with how we're responding, or how the healthcare and medical device and technology industries are responding to the COVID-19 crisis. So the first question is, how are the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries responding to this challenge? How are they evolving, and what are the prospects for transformational change? And Patrice, perhaps you could take this question first.
Sure, I'm happy to start. So I think it's a very proud moment for those of us who have worked in the pharmaceutical industry, biotechnology industry, really where I've spent my career for the last 30 years, because I feel like we've really, as an industry, risen to the challenge before us as a result of the amazing science and technology innovation that has occurred over the last really 20 years. I have focused on precision health and genomics. I've run a diagnostic company, so I see today exactly the whole way that we've used innovation at a pace that's far unimagined when you think about it. The pace of first sequencing the viral genome to understand which epitopes to make your therapeutic vaccines, to develop therapeutic antibodies, to think about novel therapeutics. The data visualization that we all look at every day as we think about what's happening around the world. I mean, the Financial Times in London has some of the most amazing data visualization, real-time, real life, and the pace and the speed at which all this is happening is just amazing. And for an industry that was perhaps not as well received a few years ago, I feel very proud to be part of this community and know that we really are responding with the urgency that we need.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. Tracy, would you add to this question, response to this question?
Sure. I'd be happy to. I come at it from the medical device side of things, and I think it's just been really exciting to see companies pivot very quickly to moving to manufacture things that weren't necessarily their first choice or highest market product. For example, in the case of Medtronic, we are a world leader in the provision of ventilators, but that was a small and very slow growing business until March. And then we were able to very quickly quintuple the rate of production of the ventilators because they were in such demand. And the other thing that I think you see industries or commercial industries doing today as well is figuring out how to tie together pieces. When they built the provisional hospital at the Javits Center in New York City, Governor Cuomo reached out to understand how they could provide monitoring for thousands and thousands of people. And so my company was able to combine the pulse oximetry business with some remote monitoring business and change the model so that one group of 10 nurses could take care of 400 patients at a time. And previously that had been probably more like a 2 patient to 1 nurse perspective. So it's that kind of rapid innovation that I think really is possible when you're strong in your business and then presented with a pandemic and you're able to respond very quickly. And that's an exciting place to be.
So there's a truly remarkable transformation. Thank you very much, Tracy. So the next question is going to be, how is the healthcare system evolving in response to this crisis in areas such as point of contact care, emergency rooms, hospitalization, intensive care, and telemedicine? And Gary, perhaps you would take this question first.
Yeah, I would start first by really paying homage to the heroism of the first-line healthcare providers. I think every day we take for granted how first-line workers put their souls on the line, the passion for their work, and here they put their lives on the line as well with a novel virus, with an infection that we didn't understand, and often without the appropriate equipment to be able to provide that care. The second piece relates to science, I think, in probably the most magnificent way. What medicine is largely decision-making under conditions of uncertainty, and a series of hypotheses being tested on an ongoing basis, and often trying to find the best data to test those hypotheses. And in the earliest going, all of the data we had were fragmented, were coming from a variety of different sources, and often were presented right in front of those physicians, nurses, and others who had to make those decisions, working together with scientists to try to get those data to be able to narrow each of those hypotheses to be able to make better and better decisions. And the flexibility of science is magnificent for us to change treatment paradigms, to pronate people and treat them on their stomachs, to avoid using ventilation as long as possible when it became clear for a subset of people, in fact, ventilation might cause more difficulties overall. So that has been truly remarkable. At the same time, the willingness to rapidly translate what appear to be findings into care almost immediately is what translational science is about. And the current infrastructure as well as technology allows us to do that. That being said, this pandemic has laid bare the challenges of the American healthcare system, the underfunding of public health, epidemiology, biostatistics, surveillance, and frankly, having great data sources. So the data have not been collected as rationally or as rapidly as would have allowed us to be able to make policy decisions, both in terms of protecting the public and in terms of how to be able to prepare the healthcare system to deliver care. The social inequities and disparities that exist in care are frightening, and the outcomes that exist in Black and brown populations and in impoverished populations really lay bare the lack of universal health coverage in the United States, and severe inequities in terms of access, which clearly are informing the healthcare delivery system as well as policymakers as to how to think about redistribution of funding and the investments that are necessary in order to take care of the population going forward. The other piece is that, unlike most of the rest of the world, the United States has an illness care system rather than a healthcare system. And it is deeply responsive to being able to take care of acute illness. But when essentially it's being fed by a fire hose, it's very, very difficult to be able to parse that out in a way that's thoughtful without having had the public health infrastructure to lay beforehand. And it's also very, very bricks and mortar oriented. So all the payment structure focuses on highly specialized care rather than more general care. And that has caused the healthcare system to have substantial difficulty financially as we've faced reductions in elective care over this period of time. It's threatened independent practices and made the capital infrastructure more difficult going forward. At the same time, the rapid response to innovation that was described before has been remarkable. So basically less than 1% of ambulatory visits were being delivered by telemedicine just in the end of February, the beginning of March. Now 70 to 80% in many academic medical centers, large hospitals, and even in ambulatory care centers are being delivered through remote settings. Additionally, the advances in terms of remote monitoring are pretty critical. As we've seen also laid bare, the care for people who are frail, chronic older adults has been catastrophic in this environment, both in terms of the way that it's structured and the protection of that population, and the focus on the ability to use telemonitoring, telemedicine, remote monitoring of overall physiologic function will protect that population to a much greater degree in keeping those people out of institutional settings. We're going to have, there's an existential crisis right now in the long-term care industry. About 100,000 people a year meet nursing home criteria in terms of admission. It is unlikely that they and their families will be as aggressively pursuing those, and the need to depend on that technology and in-home service substitutions for both hospital care as well as long-term care are at the precipice of decision making, and the technology is there to do all of it, and the data are available to be able to inform which of those populations can be best served in each of those venues.
So thank you very much, Karen. We will be coming back to some of these issues later as well. So Tracy, could I ask you to add to this question?
Sure. I think that Dr. Gottlieb gave a great overview of it. I might add from just a personal perspective. I was diagnosed with cancer at the beginning of March, and I have at this point had all of my appointments except with the surgeon via telehealth, and I am a completely satisfied user of this process because it's made it possible for me to stay very safely isolated. I don't have to go into clinics and hospitals while I'm recovering. I've had undivided attention by the physicians that have cared for me via telehealth. It has really been quite remarkable. And I think about that in the greater context of just how many things we've learned to do virtually. And I lead a team of about 250 engineers and scientists, and they're spread all over the world. And even today, as we were talking about some organizational changes, we said, really, this whole idea of what site owns what thing doesn't matter anymore because we're 250 sites at this point. And if we can learn to work and collaborate and innovate together this way, imagine what we're going to be able to accomplish. So I think that whole idea of challenging things we just never thought would be possible before is a really exciting way to think about the future and what that gives us a chance to rethink as a result.
So Tracy, so sorry to hear that diagnosis and wishing you the very best. But
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Oh, that's great. And thank you for putting that sort of personalized, positive light on some of the changes here. And actually, Tracy, I was going to ask you to respond to the next question as well. But so how are medical devices and technologies evolving in response to the COVID-19 challenge?
I think that one of the first things that has become clear to me is the ability to do things remotely is more and more important. Yeah. Particularly as in my space, as we think about robotic applications, can we take over areas that in general have been done by personnel in the hospital or care providers with robots, drug delivery as an example, perhaps, or meal delivery, something simple like that. On the flip side of that, I also think that this is giving us more and more information that we can mine for machine learning purposes to be able to make the equipment able to adapt over time to what the conditions might look like or be, or and I think it's kind of interesting. McKinsey put out a report that says by 2030 over 800 million workers will be replaced by robots worldwide, and that's about 30% of jobs typically done in the United States, and only about 12% of jobs in in other countries, but it's still a staggering amount of people. That's good and that's bad. I mean, that's a lot of retraining, obviously, of people, and how we get to some of the answers that Dr. Gottlieb spoke about in terms of how we make sure that doesn't have more impact on certain parts of our population is really important to think about. But I think it's a powerful tool that used correctly will be very exciting for our future.
So thank you very much. Thank you. So as we talk about the response to the coronavirus, I mean, I think one very critical question, which Gary, you've already touched on, is how is the public perception of science evolving in light of this pandemic? So Patrice, could you respond to this question first, please?
Sure. It's a very interesting question, Robert, because I think we all know that a well-informed public that understands what the Modernas and the Pfizers and the BioNTechs, as they're developing vaccines or convalescent antibodies, even simplicity of the diagnosis of the viral infection, having people knowledgeable and perceive that knowledge as beneficial is a very interesting time in this country, because I think we're struggling a little bit with our belief in the fundamentals of science as a country. Now, not all of us. I mean, I think we are here as leaders, as game changers, to help educate the public in what it is we do and the favorable perception of the benefit that comes from all of the science and innovation that we bring. And so I think the public perception is good. I think it could be better, and I think we're all part of that, because it makes funding for NIH, for NSF, mean something to those people. Why is Moderna working with the NIH in developing of a vaccine that, we didn't even know the virus sequence on January 9th, and it's going into a phase 3 clinical trial next month. So why is that so remarkable? And so I think the public perception should be rising in this environment where what we do is having such a fundamental impact on healthcare, on lives of people, on the future of the world to be able to respond to this virus. So I think we have more work to do, but it can only be essential to our world to be better informed, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's climate change. All of these things require the ability to understand and perceive science as beneficial. So I'm hopeful.
So thank you for a very eloquent response. And Gary, what would you add to this, please?
I think it's never been a more important time for us to tell the story and to continue to tell it right. To spend $33 billion a year in the NIH is what has differentiated the United States from the rest of the world in terms of the advancement of science, and the ROI through industry, through health, through longevity for the entire world has been remarkable. It's hard for the public to understand the relationship between an investigator-initiated R01 and the therapeutic that's going to occur next Tuesday, and how one takes each of those steps. I think people are now a little bit getting under the blankets and seeing that there are numerous steps, that there are risks at each of those steps, that it isn't a slam dunk to get those things done, but that the notion that we could be aspiring to having somebody as conservative as Tony Fauci, who's kind of lived with this since HIV, in terms of looking for vaccines and trying to find answers to terrible infections and or other illnesses, who's moved to the notion it is possible to have a vaccine that's in production 18 months after the moment of the pandemic, which, as you pointed out earlier, I think, Patrice, relates to the work we've done in genomics over this period of time, really the translation of the use of CRISPR as a diagnostic, and each of the other elements that are described really will make richer and richer the support of science. And, despite our being exposed to punditry on an ongoing basis and people constantly challenging if Chris Murray gives us a model that's off this week relative to the model that's on next week, the fact that it's all directionally real makes people understand what truth is and that science has humility, that at each step, we're able to take a step back and say, this part worked, but this part was wrong. We'll change it. And there is no, narcissistic loss in making that change. And that is what separates science overall. The other piece that I think is important is that if science is truth, we do need to make certain that we don't cut corners. And while we've been impatient with the regulatory environment, when we've allowed it at this moment to loosen up to some extent, we've seen some missteps that have been a little bit worrisome. To see diagnostics that have 35% false negative rate overall is troubling. And to bring that to market and for the FDA to be able to take a step back. The same, for antibody tests to have 5 or 10% false positive rates so that people understand what those things mean in real life. It means I can kind of trust this, but not trust it enough. And therefore, it's okay if a set of scientists stop this from being something I use day to day, because that's part of science also. And the FDA has been driven by science for a long time. It's not perfect, but it has been driven in that regard, and it has kept us to that norm. So I think it is a great day for science, a great day for scientists. And I worry that the budgetary pressures on the federal government over time that will come from the amount of difficulty that the economy is suffering over what is likely to be an extended period of time will diminish our emphasis on continuing to fund science at this level. And it's necessary for us to double down.
So thank you very much. We're going to move on to just a set of 3 more questions in a second, but I am going to encourage people in the audience to start typing in questions into the Q&A section so that we're lined up when we reach that part of the program. So we're now going to address 3 questions which talk about the prospects for the future. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to respond to each question. To keep on time, we'll have to view this as something that was like a speed round. If each response could be like a minute and a bit long, that would be great. But this has been such a terrific discussion to this point. Thank you all very much. All right, so in terms of looking to the future, and Gary, again, you've touched on this already, so I'll ask you to start this particular discussion, but what lessons regarding healthcare and biotechnology, what weaknesses has this virus laid bare? If you could have some of your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Sure. Clearly, the American healthcare system is differentiated from its peers in the industrialized world by being not having adequate investment in public health. So when we compare public health outcomes, it's an inappropriate comparison. And that means investments not only in all the elements that we're seeing in the public health system, but it also means in the social determinants of health, which have clearly been determinants of the adverse outcomes that we've seen, the effects of poverty, of diet, of violence, as well as on access to care, have had, as you can see, downstream effects on people's response to an infection or their ability to be able to be cared for. The notion of sheltering in place when you're homeless, or people living in crowded housing, or hospitals now becoming involved as food banks with their populations in order for people to be able to essentially survive and then to be able to thrive after infection or in this environment is pretty critical. The second is the payment system has so overemphasized highly specialized care. And the emphasis on highly specialized care means that we have de-emphasized primary care and access to care overall, which promotes health, but it also creates an intense bricks and mortar, highly capitalized system that's inflexible. So most of the healthcare system and its dollars are sitting in integrated delivery systems in hospitals and elsewhere, which are sitting with massive amounts of debt service and depreciation that will be difficult to service when we move to remote care, which we're going to move to. And we're not going to have a glide path, it's going to be a cliff. And that's going to be challenging. But the notion that we can trust data when we see it, we can trust what we see physically, when we see images and we share them, and that we can do that remotely and do it really efficiently, and ultimately use bots to help us as well to be able to even make more efficient those interactions, I think is here. It's translatable. It's going to be reimbursable. It'll be protectable in the cloud from a HIPAA perspective, and I think we're going to see rapid transformation in that area.
Thank you very much, Gary. Patrice, what would you add to this discussion?
So I think Gary does a great job describing it from the perspective of healthcare. When I think about it from the perspective of pharma and biotechnology, I think what we've seen is, again, a sense of urgency to use all the tools and technologies at our disposal to work hand in hand with regulators. I think has been a real lesson around emergency use authorization to move things quickly. I think we're going to learn how this experiment goes. I mean, we've never developed and delivered a vaccine in the time we are anticipating we will do. So we're moving into phase 3 clinical trials while we're still reading out phase 1B, phase 2A data, assuming we have safety and efficacy ready to go at a dosage in phase 3. So I think we're learning to move quickly. Pharma hasn't traditionally been a fast mover, but what you've seen in the pharma community is building relationships with the biotechnology communities in new ways to say, we can help you move this vaccine more quickly. We can help you move this antibody sequencing, identifying antibodies that can be therapeutics. And then the two of them working together in really important partnerships and ways. And so I think we'll hope. I think to add just one thing, I think of a lesson as well, more from the healthcare. It has been wonderful. My daughter is a med student right now at UMass Medical Center. To see what's happening at the level of hospitals that didn't really ever anticipate the scale and the effort that was going to be required to do what they're doing every day now. And I think it's that resiliency of those hospitals, the people, their dedication has been a wonderful lesson for really across the world to see. So I think that's, something that if we can break down these barriers, deal with the healthcare disparities, and really understand how to work well together, the surgeon, the fellow, all of those, which have been, sometimes challenging. So just some thoughts.
Thank you very much. And Tracy.
Well, Gary and Patrice certainly hit a lot of the things that I probably would have covered, but I think the other thing I'd like to add in terms of something that I think it became very troublesome that we didn't anticipate was the weakness of our supply chain in the United States. I mean, to not have been able to get masks, and it was just it has to be something that we pay a lot more attention to, and we figure out how to get the right kind of stockpiles. The states bidding against each other to get equipment. I mean, really, we have to be able to do better than that.
That is a wonderful, excellent point. Thank you. And I know that in New York, hospitals are being directed to have much longer stockpile of PPE for the future, very much compared to the past.
Robert, I'd like to add to that because I think just one additional comment. The lack of a unified national public health response that enabled rather than disabled the states to work together is really a disservice to our citizens. And we felt it from the very beginning, and we still feel it today. And it's just one of those things that we should learn from that and figure out how to do this better.
The supply chain is such a perfect example of the lack of that coordination, because it's something that would have been so easy to coordinate. It would have allowed us to basically command production, understand resource distribution as the surge was happening, be able to essentially create substantial savings on the production side, and ensure that everybody, even in the poorest hospital, was perfectly protected and had all of the supplies that were necessary, because the grid is there to see. And there are collaborative purchasing ventures that exist among the hospitals, and the fact that they were not enabled in such a way to collaborate among them and then to be used in a way that was federalized is obviously, as you point out, cost countless lives.
So thank you. That was such an important point. I think actually, because I love the way this sort of discussion is developing organically now, I'm going to move on to the last question. Because I think, the sort of interacting thoughts of our panelists here will be just tremendous. So what are the prospects that we've reached a turning point for the better? Now, this disease and the impact and the toll it has taken has been just dreadful. I mean, there's no silver lining, but in that respect. But could this be a turning point for healthcare, for medical technologies, for public appreciation of biotechnology, as you said, Patrice, of entirely new and more effective forms of healthcare, as you described, Tracy, for science to have its shining moment, as you've described, Gary. So what are the prospects that we can have learned lasting, important, and positive lessons from this? So I'll ask Patrice to start this discussion, if I may.
Sure. It's a very interesting and important question. So here in Rhode Island, where I am, there's been huge disparity laid bare in the healthcare system. The majority, I think, 45%, if not 50% of COVID-19 patients have been Black or brown. And the population here is about 14 to 18%. It goes to the way the communities in which these populations have been discriminated against for living situations, for access to good jobs that include healthcare and so forth. And I think it's giving everyone at the top a pause and say, we need to do something different and better for our population. And I think when you overlay that with the climate of the Black Lives Matter movement right now, we cannot forget the need to embrace diversity in all of the roles that we play as leaders in the community, and make it a more just and righteous country where we can include all. So it's a little bit of let's transform, let's use these movements together to make a difference in all aspects of what we do.
So thank you very much, Patrice. Tracy, what would your final comments be in this discussion? Until we get to the question session, at least, please.
I tend to be an optimist, and I get my day mostly by being an optimist, I would say, especially in the last couple of months. I believe that this is a turning point, maybe not the complete 90-degree we need to make, but I think we will have gathered confidence in our ability to do things we didn't think were possible before. And some of the issues that we face seem very hard to solve. So I hope we can take out of this that came from being able to attack some pretty big problems and just keep focusing on using the technologies and the knowledge that we have to make the world a better place for everybody.
Thank you very much. And Gary, what would be your final words on this topic?
So from a policy perspective, clearly universal health coverage is demanded by each of the outcomes that are being described. It's the only platform in which great science can be translated to the benefit of the entire population with the highest degree of equality. And that's not, I'm not advocating a specific approach. The outcomes in Germany with an entirely private healthcare system that has universal health coverage are better than they are in the NHS, which has a single payer system. And the level of inequity in the Netherlands, which is a private system, is less than the inequity in Canada. But they all have universal coverage. And that means universal access to excellence, to quality, and the ability to essentially then create a set of incentives that promote investment in the social determinants of health. Because without a social safety net, there is no healthcare system that's functional or has the capacity to be able to deliver. And we can overvalue a single therapeutic, but that single therapeutic will only touch a tiny fragment of the population unless we have the blanket investment in coverage, access, and an excellence of the infrastructure. And I believe that this could be a turning point in that regard. It creates a real confluence of interest in regard to the issues of discrimination and devaluation of people of color and impoverished populations with the need that exists and is right in front of us with this plague.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So that was just a terrific discussion. The questions are coming in, and what I'm going to do is act as traffic control here. I'm going to pass each question to one of the three of you, but if anybody else wants to add in the conversation, please go ahead and do so. So I've responded to a couple of questions already. The first question I want to pass on to you, Tracy, is from Riyad Mohammed. Telemedicine is a clear growth due to the pandemic. Are there other innovations you see emerging or being maintained in the current environment? So what are the sort of other really important trends are we seeing for emerging in medical devices or medical technologies or methodologies? So if I could ask you to respond to that, Tracy.
Sure, I'm very focused on product development, so I'll answer perhaps from that perspective. The ability to do remote monitoring of robots in Boston from Kiev, from Munich, and being able to remotely turn them off and on and manipulate them was something that we built in a weekend, and it's made all the difference in the world for us to be able to continue with progress. The other thing that was really fascinating to me was how creative people could get with using 3D printing to manufacture things that otherwise they would have taken to a shop and interacted with the team at that company and spent probably a lot more money. So it's not the answer to everything, but it was a remarkably helpful tool for us as we were working through some prototypes. Those are the things that come to mind to me most immediately. Other members of the panel with any other ideas?
I've seen in trying to work on models of care in the home to kind of substitute upstream for the use of hospitals, a number of increasingly light technologies that can do essentially the equivalent of complete telemetry with pulse ox complete telemetry and create the dashboards that can be monitored by a paramedic coming from a home or in central location that also then provide extraordinary modeling data and the ability to obviously have a longer battery life as well as lighter and lighter technologies like those patches. I think I've seen them rapidly used, and I think they're going to just continue to be turned around. That'll help us in a dramatic way in dealing with the long-term care solutions and in enabling both in-home care workers as well as individuals to be able to manage at home with chronic illnesses, which obviously are ubiquitous in the older adult population and the most important predictors of the use of long-term care.
So I'm going to actually direct the next question, if I may, to you, Patrice. As you've mentioned the supply chain, I know you all did at different points as a critical issue. So this is from Jane Starr. This pandemic has pointed out the weaknesses of our USA supply chain. Please comment how this is changing as we get further into this health emergency. So, is the supply chain adjusting? Is it robust enough? Is it, is it likely to be under great stress again in the future?
It's on mute.
It's Patrice, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
There I go.
Yeah.
Really good and important question, because the supply chain is a fundamental question we've talked a little bit about for every aspect of this pandemic, whether it would be, do I have all the reagents necessary to collect the nasal swab, to then do the PCR or the molecular detection of the virus? Do I have the instruments and the reagents necessary to run the machine? Do I have the ability to report out information back to my physician who ordered the test? Do I have the PPEs that are necessary for healthcare workers, for schools, for workers as they return back to the workplace? So it's involved in every aspect. Ventilators, making car manufacturers now manufacture ventilators, which are very complicated. I think, and it's not just the US supply chain either. Many of these things come from Asia, Asian countries, China, manufacturing, which has done so much in the manufacturing of many of the aspects of the supply chain for all of these things. I think we have it in better control, but you never know where that the next link will fall when you lose, one part of the PPE protective device. I think what we've done is we've learned to be creative in rapidly validating what might be a new swab that allows you to collect the sample, and working with the FDA immediately to say, well, this one that we've always used could be replaced by this. And that has happened across. And again, it's the partnership with the FDA in many aspects of this that has been very responsive and allowed us to do these things. So it's not a definitive answer, but we're much better than we were 2 months ago, and it still continues to get better.
That's great. That's great. And actually, I'm just sort of linking your response there, Patrice, to Tracy's response to the previous question about PPE and prototyping. And one of the things I've been very proud at Rensselaer that we've been able to do is to step in and fill gaps in local healthcare systems, for example, with sterilization and with sterilization system, and with creating face shields. And we can't create a supply chain of millions, but we have to be able to create many thousands of face shields for local healthcare partners.
You're absolutely right. We've seen that all over. One of our here in Rhode Island, design is a big, huge industry, and a highest quality leather manufacturer of high-end bags has now converted to making face shields because it allowed her to keep her workers employed and respond to the immediate need of the hospital, 2 miles away. So yeah, I think many people have become creative.
Yeah. And so the next question I'm going to ask you to respond to, Gary, is from our Dean of Science, Kurt Brenneman, who sends greetings. So he's asking, in your view, what are the most important areas of education needed for the healthcare-related data scientists of the future?
One, I think those healthcare-related data scientists need to be exposed to the clinical condition, to be able to understand each of the areas of science and how they relate to clinical outcomes. Healthcare-related data scientists are going to be among the most important contributors to the future of healthcare delivery. And they're going to be able to inform discovery and help us to have a variety of tools to be able to bring those discoveries to translation and to monetization, which is, the real use overall, much more rapidly. I'm so excited about what's happening with real world evidence and being able to model those data and to have them available. But those data scientists need to understand, and as they're also moving things into artificial intelligence, what's real and what assumptions are real and what the context is from a clinical perspective. And so we can't isolate them from clinical knowledge and clinical conditions. The cases that they need to study and model need to be real cases as much as possible, and to expose them to clinical internships where those data are being used either to catalyze great science or to catalyze products and delivery of specific diagnostics or therapeutics would be critically important and really exciting.
So thank you, Gary. And I think broadly in our data analytics and artificial intelligence areas that we're really excited with the partnerships we have with IBM and others, but that linkage with domain experts is always a critical aspect. So thank you for emphasizing that. Now, we have to be careful that we get what we wish for. I've got a whole bunch of questions here, and I'm going to have to triage somewhat to those which I think are most relevant to the current discussion. So forgive me for if I have to pass over a few questions, but thank you for all the great questions which are coming in. So there are two related questions regarding telemedicine and telehealth. So the first is, are there any negative consequences? How is this going to potentially transform care for elderly parents? So I think I'll ask you, if you would, Tracy, to respond to that initially. And then if anybody else wants to join the discussion as well, that would be great.
Sure, I'd be happy to at least throw out a few thoughts on the topic. I know that one of the reasons I think telepresence is working so well with my existing organization is we've already had a chance to build relationships. So we're not meeting for the first time via anything each other. And I sometimes think that it could be challenging for some people to be as comfortable meeting their doctor for the first time through telemedicine. There's probably be some initial comfort with the technology by some people. I'm a technologist, so it seemed perfectly natural to me. Maybe not everybody will feel that way. And I think that in terms of moving forward, it'll just be important for us to figure out when are the right times to use these tools and when are the wrong times, and do you have to have a mix of them? That would be my vote, actually, for a mix.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else want to add to that?
So the decision making is not purely algorithmic, and the data are often nuanced, and decision making in clinical care requires a number of usually there are heuristics involved in decision making, and how much nuance is lost through a screen is unclear. And most of us haven't provided care only virtually. We provided it using cues that we're able to obtain from people in a one-on-one close setting. And we've seen, clinical care get worse as people spend less and less time with their patients in their office. They don't ask the appropriate questions. They don't do complete physical exams. That's because they've lost the nuance. They've lost a great deal of what's the power of the relationship and the interaction. And we need to figure out what components do we lose in the two-dimensionality that we have, and what the frequency of face-to-face visits is necessary, and how much denial we have as clinicians about the importance of the physical exam and other elements that are difficult to obtain without touch. And there's a component of the tenderest touch that's part of empathy, and all of medicine is about accurate empathy. The accurate component could be because of data and science. The accurate component could be because of understanding the experience. But where that vacuum is not clearly understood yet in this medium, and we need to be able to move that forward over time to be able to truly appreciate what the difference is. For the older adult population, the other component that we really haven't talked about is social isolation. And technology needs to help us with that social isolation. So we need book clubs and interactions. We need two-way video, and constantly to be able to interact in that regard. We need to appreciate what components are satisfied by that technology and what components aren't, and that need a sense of closeness, even for those who will have grown up with tons of technology.
So this is such a great discussion. I am going to ask for the panelist patients, and for those of you who I really hope will stay from the audience, we're going to run on maybe an extra 5 to 10 minutes from this point, just because I think these are great questions, great answers, and I don't want to lose the moment. But I'm just giving that timing so people don't get nervous. This is going to go on till like 9 in the evening. But there's some great questions here. I still want to get to our panelists, if I may. So there's a question from Tom Weiss, which I'm going to paraphrase as, what are we missing in this crisis? What technologies, whether they're data technologies or device technologies, do we need and are not there? And sorry, Tom, I didn't pose that question as eloquently as you did. I wish I just read out your question at this point. But so, anything from one of the panelists on, what do we lack? What do we need?
I would start with trying to figure out how we can make certain, if we're at the acute phase, how we take care of healthcare providers. We've had far too many infections about healthcare providers, and it's not all about doffing and donning. I mean, there's a component that is, but there are probably critical areas about the environment in which we're treating patients, separation with those patients, frequency of interaction with those patients, how the team can deliver that care, that would both inform how to protect providers, how to improve care, and then how we can add families and visitors to that care in the acute setting. And we've had to make harsh decisions because we've had to be intensely protective, but in understanding that set of transactions, it can enable some technologies. I'm only reminded because in my global health work, I started at Partners in Health right in the middle of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and we jumped into the fire providing care in Sierra Leone and Liberia in deeply isolated settings. And if you take a look now, and we lost numerous healthcare providers. At Partners in Health, we had a couple of people who were infected, but you saw the decimation of healthcare providers in places that had that are medical deserts overall. And there are amazing technologies now in which basically you can treat people through screens, through transparent screens, and with gloves that allow full touch, but through those gloves that completely protect the healthcare providers and have people during the infectious period completely protected that weren't even conceptualized at that time. And now that are ubiquitous. They were used extensively in the Congo, just as an example. But there are numerous technologies, I believe, that can protect those healthcare providers and can protect patients in that set of transactions that we have missed and that will be necessary as there are more waves even now.
So I'd like to respond to Robert, because I think one of the things, we still know so little about this virus and what it does to the human body, the disparity of the heterogeneity of the disease in individuals. So, an average healthy 30-year-old, no impact. For some reason, another 30-year-old will have devastating lung disease and require a lung transplant. Or, 60-year-olds, some are fine, some are not at all. There's tremendous kidney effects or whatever. So we have so much more to learn about the heterogeneity of the individual and its response to the virus. And I think that is also going to translate as we move into therapeutics and vaccines, where we are still going to require some innovation in our understanding of biology related to efficacy and safety.
So we have two last questions at this point, and the first is just a comment I want to read out and make sure we capture. So from Raul Lopez Palm, comment to the panel: I hope that in your province you are able and motivated to extend participation opportunities to our excellent students and graduates. Robert can be recipient conduit of those energies. Thank you. So let's make sure we hold that thought. I'm going to ask Tom Bedoven, our announcer in the background. Can you, at the last minute here, Tom, make sure, if it's not already there, that my contact information, email, is on the concluding slide or slides you will show in a couple of minutes, so that we can capture that thought and follow up on the opportunity.
Will do. Thank Dr. Hall.
Thank you very much. Then the last question, which I would really be grateful to a response from each of the panelists, because it's such a critical one. And this is from Jim Langdon. And I think it's referring back to one specific comment made earlier. If 45% of Black and brown people are victims of COVID, I'm not sure that was exactly what was said, but we know it's disproportionately large. Is it because they are genetically more susceptible, or more susceptible by social attitude and living conditions? And I know this isn't exactly the topic of this panel, but it's such a critical question but it will be great to get each of your responses. And maybe, Tracy, you would start with that response?
Sure, and I have nothing but opinion to back up what I will say because I don't have the scientific background to answer this question. But I strongly believe it's due to the social conditions and the environment that people are trying to battle disease in. Starting out probably with a deficit when they become ill, not perhaps having access as quickly as they need it, and not having long-term support to recover. I don't know how that can't be a huge contributor to this issue.
Thank you. Thank you. Patrice?
I would agree, because I've raised it here in Rhode Island where the incidence has been high. And I think it is in these homes where many people, family settings where they live together, they work in high risk industries, whether it be the nursing home, healthcare, Walmart worker, they don't have the liberty often of having a high paying job that allows them to work from home. So they're putting themselves at risk all the time. And again, I think it's really not so much genetic, but really a social determinants.
Thank you. Thank you. And Gary?
I think it's clear first, poverty makes you sick. And people who have poor access to healthcare are at further risk overall. And so when one looks at prevalence rates of diabetes and hypertension for people who live in food deserts and don't have access to the full bevy of nutritional foods, who have housing insecurity, the risk is even higher. The cluster, for example, the highest cluster in Massachusetts was in Chelsea, in a population that's been, iterative survivor populations of refugees and people living in clustered housing at close quarters, and also obviously at substantial risk in terms of their means overall. And so, in a stark example, in Singapore, where basically the illness has been under control and eradicated, the biggest outbreak was in congregate housing from foreign workers who are not genetically different than the rest of Singaporeans. So this is the notion of why all the work that we do has to have a social and policy component to it, or else the science won't be translated for the masses. We'll lose the ROI in this great discovery.
So thank you. And thank all the panelists for a great discussion, a really terrific discussion. I'm very sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. If anybody would like to follow up, again, my contact information now will be in the last slide. So I want to thank the panelists once more. I certainly want to thank all the audience for the great questions. So I'll turn it back over to our announcer, who will conclude with details for future webinars and virtual events.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. I want to thank all the panelists as well for participating today, and for everyone in attendance. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. You will be receiving an email within the next 24 hours with today's recording, along with a brief survey asking for feedback. Be sure to check your email moving forward for other webinars, and please save the date for June 24th for our next webinar. Rensselaer Silicon Valley Executive Council presents the impact of COVID-19 on current and future consumer expectations. Also, please save the date for our Pi Day on June 28th, a virtual event where we support our institute and stay engaged with our community online. For more details, please visit piday.rpi.edu. And now more than ever, support is needed to continue the exceptional tradition of Rensselaer education for our incoming and current students. As we have heard today from Ms. Murtaugh and Dr. Hall, many ways for you to provide support, including the newly established Rensselaer Research Fund, the Student Relief Fund, and the Annual Fund. A big thank you to those who have generously supported these efforts recently. For more details, please visit giving.rpi.edu for more information. Thank you again for joining us today. Stay safe and healthy and have a great afternoon.